So wonderful to have you all with us this evening. I'm Reverend Aaron Lauer. I'm one of the associate pastors here at Coral Gables Congregational United Church of Christ, and we are just so excited to be hosting you all for this wonderful community event and panel discussion this evening. It's been a long time coming. We were going to do it in January and then had to delay a bit, but we're so glad to have you all here and with us for this important documentary screening and this important community discussion. I want to give a special thank you to South Florida Mindful Communities, who are our partners in hosting this event. South Florida Mindful Communities is dedicated to teaching and training and advocacy around mindfulness and mindfulness practices here in South Florida. And so we are indebted to their partnership in this event and all of the things that they have done to make this event come alive. Coral Gables Congregational United Church of Christ is a wise congregation, and what that means is we are welcoming, inclusive, supportive, and engaged around issues of mental health. And this has been an issue that we've been very concerned with for the past few years. And so, especially when it comes to issues around children and youth mental health. And so when we found out about this documentary and working with the South Florida Mindful Communities on this, we knew we had to host this event and make this a reality. So this is something that we at this church really do see as a ministry, and we see it as a part of our work out in the community. Well, you came this evening to watch a documentary and to listen to a bunch of smart people talk about their areas of expertise, so we're going to get right to that. What a wonderful film and what a wonderful message of hope there at the end, that we can address these issues as a community, that we're not lost in all of this, that we have each other and we have a way forward for our children and for our future. Well, friends, let me introduce our panelists for this evening, and we are so thankful for all of you for participating in this wonderful discussion, and we look forward to learning from your wisdom. Our first panelist this evening is Judge Steve Leifman, who serves on the 11th Judicial Circuit Court of Florida. And Judge Leifman led the creation of the Miami Center for Mental Health and Recovery. We also have Dr. Kimberly Hull-Miziazik, who is the Clinical Director of the Institute for Individual and Family Counseling at the University of Miami. Dr. Ashwin Mehta is the Director of Integrative Medicine at Memorial Healthcare in Hollywood, Florida. And then we have Dr. Daniel Sheridan, who is the Clinical Director at the Children's Bereavement Center here in Miami. And finally, we have Valerie York Zimmerman, who is a certified mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher and the founder of Miami Mindfulness and Mindful Kids Miami. Pamela Hollingsworth from the Early Learning Coalition was scheduled to be a panelist this evening, but she had a health issue come up, so she wasn't able to join us. So we're holding Pamela in our hearts this evening and her family. Well, let's begin. Judge Leifman, I can start with you. In your years of experience working with people suffering with mental illness in the criminal justice system, how do you see the pervasive and harmful effects of ACEs manifesting in the lives of adults?
So thank you for that. Thank you for putting on this program. It is a much larger problem than any of us realize. There was a longitudinal study by SAMHSA, which is the federal agency for substance abuse and mental health. And what they found over a 10-year study is that 92% of all the women in jails and prisons in the United States with serious mental illnesses have horrific histories of trauma, mostly sexual abuse. And about 75% of men in jails and prisons with serious mental illnesses also have horrific histories of trauma. sometimes sexual abuse, more likely to be victims of domestic violence, or witnesses of really horrific violent crimes like a soldier might see in active duty. And so we are finally starting to understand and realize that not only do we need to be trauma-informed so we don't re-traumatize people in our system, but we also have to start helping people access treatment. And there are so many other studies that show for a large part of this population, even putting them in jail for 3 days significantly increases recidivism rates, almost doubles it if they're in 8 to 12 days. And, people think, we want to improve public safety, but in some ways, through our actions, because we've not been well educated and informed, we've actually made it worse. And so there are a lot of things that we need to start doing, and we are starting to do, at least here in Miami-Dade County, and hopefully nationally, to address this issue.
Thank you, Judge Leffman. Yes, Dr. Gomez-Yazek, thank you. As your work as a clinician, as a clinic director, can you tell us about the ways in which you see adverse childhood experiences in the lives of the families and the children that you work with, and maybe some community ways that we can respond to these issues?
Well, thank you so much, Reverend Aaron, for arranging this event, screening this powerful documentary, allowing us in your congregation to understand the effects of toxic stress in children. Thank you for bringing us on this panel. Also, with what we're seeing in Ukraine as well, in real time, understanding, what the children and families fleeing as refugees may be going through. It's, kind of made all too real again in the news, hearing these stories every day. So I'm pleased to be here, and I'm excited to be in a church. I'm excited of the possibility of us being a trauma-informed congregation. And I think, as they said in the documentary, all the efforts will start with each one of us, and there could be a whole host of creative and wise actions that we can all together come up with. And I think this event is one example of that. And so you asked me to speak a little bit about how I see adverse events play out in some of the children and families that I've treated. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in child and family traumatic stress. Trained with the Yale Childhood Violent Trauma Clinic, working with in the documentary they said you have to be there where children are. And so there was a unique partnership with the New Haven Police Department and the Child Psychiatry Clinic. And each week we would work together with the police and meet together to learn about cases that the police have responded to, where children who are often, witness to some of these domestic violence incidents, they're there, they let us know. We do acute responses, or we do follow-up home visits. And if they, with the screening, they meet criteria to come into the clinic, we bring them into the clinic. So I think my work could be best exemplified through a story, through the story of a client, we'll call him 7-year-old Tony, who was referred to us by a partnership with the New Haven Police Department, who witnessed, heard gunshots in his neighborhood and also witnessed someone fleeing. He had difficulties sleeping after that, had nightmares. At school, difficulties concentrating, not doing his homework at home. Upon further screening, finding out that he also witnessed domestic violence in his home. He was in the care of his grandmother, a very sweet, helpful grandmother. Can everybody hear me still? Okay, great. And she just didn't understand what was wrong with him. Why can't he just do his homework when I ask him to? Why can't he make the bed without getting aggressive with me? Why can't he pay attention in school? And the list goes on. But frequently, children, when they're left alone with their traumatic reactions, and they go unrecognized and unheard and unseen, the symptomatic behavior, the symptoms, is their way of telling us what's going on with them. And so, in our session, a 5-session evidence-based family strengthening treatment, we were able to turn the volume down on those traumatic reactions that Tony was having. Grandma was able to be equipped with tools how to help him. She was able to understand how trauma affects children, how it affects the way they think, the way they feel in their bodies, and the things that they do. And that there are trauma reminders out there that can serve to put them further in not in control, if they don't recognize them and understand how to cope with them. And they were even also able to draw upon their own cultural practices. Grandma was very religious, so we were able to incorporate prayer, focused breathing, and things like that in the session. And then Tony was able to return to school, was able to concentrate, was able to do his homework, finding out that he didn't want to do it because it would remind him of Dad, because Dad was with him when he would do his homework, and was able to regain psychological control. And so I think in terms of how we can move forward, it's, as they said in the video, very beautiful documentary. Instead of why are you like that, it's what has happened to you. And I think tonight there's just a wealth of ways that we can together think about being a trauma-informed congregation, maybe having a psychologist in residence, or working with you as a pastor. I think not being afraid to reach out when you see something, when you see signs and symptoms. And I think, there's frameworks for being trauma-informed. So the first one we already accomplished tonight, to recognize the impact of adverse events and how common they are, to respond in a developmentally appropriate way to children, to know what reactions look like. If Tommy is no longer like himself, more irritable, more withdrawn, not relating interpersonally very well, looking at these signs and symptoms and knowing where to refer and how not to re-traumatize again. And I think we can do that here as a trauma-informed congregation and participate more fully in the body of Christ and be the feet and hands of Him to all the people that we meet and to the children who are hurting around the world, and that we can see something now that we're more informed and know what to do.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Mehta, we'd love to hear your perspective on this as well, as a medical doctor. How do you see the often lifelong effects of adverse childhood experiences, the stress, the trauma, and also maybe a little bit about the beneficial practices, the mindfulness, the yoga that you have such a specialty in. And again, any wise actions for the community that we can take on to address these issues.
Sure, thank you, Reverend Lauer, for bringing us together and your kind invitation to participate with this wonderful panel. I'm humbled and delighted to be with all of you tonight. I have the privilege of practicing in a style of practice called integrative medicine, which I think what is unique about integrative medicine, and actually Dr. Harris Burke in the documentary really is practicing integrative medicine, whether or not she refers to it as such. Counseling regarding nutrition, exercise, mind-body medicine techniques. So integrative medicine really draws upon the wisdom of ancient healing traditions from all over the world and brings that wisdom to bear in a very evidence-based way in order to improve quality of life throughout the spectrum of chronic illness. And so I think that a really unique component of integrative medicine is to understand this mind-body entity and the fact that what happens in the mind impacts our bodies, and what happens in our bodies impacts our minds. So when it comes to improving physical and mental health, we need to bring all of these modalities to bear in a comprehensive way in order to improve health for the individuals whom we serve and are caring for. And there's this concept that is referred to as neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity simply refers to, if you can imagine a computer, we can type away as much as we want on the keyboard of that computer, but nothing in terms of the wiring is really changing inside that machine. Well, our brains are actually quite different. With repetitive patterns of thinking, behaviors, even life experiences, our hardware actually changes. There's a rewiring of the brain that occurs, and that is called neuroplasticity. So when it comes to stress and adverse childhood events and traumas, which are really inevitable aspects of human embodiment, when it comes to addressing these in an evidence-based way, how do we distinguish stress from toxic stress? It's when that neuroplasticity has actually changed our brain's hardware to be in these non-constructive patterns and loops, so that hardware has actually gelled in a certain way that makes it difficult to break out of these patterns. And what does mindfulness do? What does yoga do? What does even acupuncture and so many other modalities, what do these do? Well, they help us actually break free of these patterns. They help us move the needle if we can kind of think of our bodies as operating in a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum is the stress response, that's the fight and flight end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum is rest and digest, that's the healing response, that's the parasympathetic end of the spectrum. So stress becomes toxic when our needle goes and gets stuck on the fight and flight end of the spectrum. And modalities like mindfulness and yoga and so many of these other wonderful modalities that we've talked about, that we've heard tonight, they actually help that needle get unstuck from that fight and flight end of the spectrum and start to use this aspect, this process of neuroplasticity towards our favor in order to improve both physical and mental health. And I think when it comes to wise actions, really I think that you said it, being welcoming, being inclusive, being supportive, and being engaged is a wonderful way to start. And within the mindfulness community, I would say that being welcoming, inclusive, supportive, and engaged means not to lose the forest for the trees. I think that when it comes to clinical research and clinical trials, it's really important that the details and semantics are kept very straight. However, we need to meet our impractical reality. When it comes to my clinical practice, I distill this evidence, this scientific information, in order to really make it meaningful and fun for my clients to participate in these positive health behaviors, because it's not really going to change us if we don't stick to it. So we have to know why it's good for us. We have to enjoy it, and it has to be accessible to us for any of these practices to really stick. So I think that when it comes to wise behaviors, really understanding that whether we call it meditation or mindfulness or affirmations or prayer or a devotional practice. In my clinical practice, all of these things are really, it's the same salad, different dressing. So I think that really recognizing that is a really nice step forward towards true healing. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Doctor. Well, Dr. Sheridan, you work specifically with children and youth who are grieving the death of a loved one at the Children's Bereavement Center. And I'm wondering, could you address the ways that these specific traumatic events affects the lives of children and what you've seen in your practice? And what are some things that you do to help end the suffering of these young people who are in your care? And again, any community actions that you think we should be taking to help address these issues with the youth that you serve?
Absolutely, and thank you for the invitation today. So, what we know in the state of Florida is that 1 in 12 children will experience the death of a parent or sibling by the time they're 18. And if we think about that in very real, practical numbers, that's about 2 children in every classroom will experience the death of a parent or sibling by 18. And that's a significant number. And the thing about grief is that grief never goes away. It's not like a cold where you'll feel better in a week or 2. Grief stays with us. It's not something that ends. We just learn to live with it differently. So when grief is not addressed, when grief is not talked about, when children aren't given the tools to deal with their feelings, it can linger, it can fester, and it can lead to depression, anxiety. There could be post-traumatic stress symptoms as a result of the death, decreases in academic performance. The list can go on. What's challenging about grief long-term for anybody, whether you're a kid or you're an adult, is that there are 2 types of loss. There is the primary loss, which is the physical death of somebody in our life and the grief that comes from that. But what's more challenging for all of us is the secondary losses, which are the losses that continue throughout our life. For children, as an example, graduations, to have a graduation, to have a birthday, any major life event where your loved one is no longer here to celebrate, to be there with you, it magnifies their absence. It brings up that feeling of grief. And these are moments we all go through in our lives, whether it's holidays, weddings, any time that we come together as community, as family, as friends, and celebrate and laugh together, that grief can be there. So what we do at the Children's Bereavement Center is we provide a dedicated space each week, which is now online, where whether you're a child or you're an adult, you have a place to have support and connection. You have community. You are not alone with your feelings. There is a safety where you can open up and share, this is how I'm feeling, and I think I'm going crazy. And people say, no, you're not crazy, that's how I felt yesterday. So there's a normalization, there's a safety that's built. So people don't feel ashamed about how they feel. They don't feel, a stigma of things that are actually quite normal. So my wise action for you all is to ask people, if you know someone who's grieving, whether it's a child or it's an adult, ask them how they're doing. Don't assume they're going to come and talk to you. It's very scary to open up about these feelings, these experiences. There's worries that are going to make people uncomfortable. So go to them. If you know they're grieving, ask, how are you doing? You've been on my mind. How's your family? Whatever feels true to you and authentic to you, but open the conversation and create that safety for them so they know somebody is willing to listen and to be there for them in their time of grief.
Thank you, Dr. Sheridan. Yeah. As a pastor, even I need to hear that. I need to be asking my people how they're doing. Well, Mr. York Zimmerman, thank you as well for being here and such a big part of planning this event and making it happen. In your work with mindfulness for children, youth, and adults, where do you see chronic stress, ACEs, trauma in the lives of the people that you serve? And how does mindfulness help people respond to this stress and heal from this trauma? And what are the ways that education can play a role in addressing these issues? And of course, what's a community action that we can take? We'd love to hear that as well.
Thank you, Aaron. And I want to thank also Pastors Lori and Megan and you for having us here and for doing this evening. Well, I'm going to be introducing somebody. And in light of the things that are going on, I may deviate a little bit, if that's allowed. We hear a lot about community, and it's a big part of what we're talking about this evening. And some of you may already know this story, but I would like to share it with those of you who do not. People are talking about the great Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Zen master and great mindfulness teacher who died in January at the age of 95. In 1966, he wrote to Dr. Martin Luther King to ask him to help him in support of ending the war in Vietnam. They met in 1966, and at that time they talked about peace and about freedom and about rights, human rights, and they became friends. And for the next couple of years, they didn't really see each other very much, but the energy that arose from the meeting of, as many people refer to them as the two great giants, when these two great giants came together, they created an energy that exists with us today. And in the last meeting they had, they talked about, well actually they had been talking about it for a while, but in the last meeting that they had, they promised that together, along with other faith leaders of their time, there was a big emphasis on what Dr. King called the beloved community. And they promised to work together to build this beloved community. Unfortunately, of course, Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, but at that time, Thich Nhat Hanh decided he would dedicate the rest of his life to trying to create a beloved community. There are places in this country, and even if we look at Ukraine now, what kind of a beloved community are they creating? All of these people coming together from every walk of life to do whatever is needed to serve and to try to bring peace. So this whole issue, I think, of community is really important. And this leads me to an introduction I'd like to make. I've asked a friend to come and speak with you this evening, and to talk a little bit about the work that she has been doing. And one of the reasons why I wanted to ask her to share with us is because she spent a lot of time, she's a formidable force in this community and has been for years. Right now she is an Advanced Leadership Initiative Fellow at Harvard, but many of you may know her through the last 8 years of her work at the Children's Trust. She served in a couple of capacities. One of them is as Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, along with being the Chief Information Officer, or as the Chief Programs Officer and the Chief Information Officer. Now, I don't know about you, but I know that is a very big job. And she has done wonderful things in this community, including lead a team of over 2,000 women who built 7 homes in Liberty City. So I'd like to ask you all, please, to join me in welcoming Stephanie Sylvester to tell us a little bit about what she's doing now, which will bring more good to our community and to communities beyond our own. Stephanie, please.
Can I borrow this?
Yes, go right ahead.
So thank you, Valerie. Thank you, everybody. So first, in the spirit of mindfulness, this is extremely awkward and uncomfortable, but I'm learning how to live into my discomfort. And this year, in addition to spending a year learning, I'm also spending a year building and filling my courage back. So Valerie has decided to give me an opportunity to share with you what I'm working on. I'm super excited about it. It's all around how do we create a space and leverage technology to really and truly help people feel good about themselves. And one of the things about ACES is that it's about resiliency, and it's a little bit easier for you to be resilient if you feel good about yourself. If you don't define yourself by your test scores, if you fail your test, that doesn't cause your world to come falling down on top of you. But you have to have a strong sense of self. And so for the past, I don't know, about 6 years, I've been talking to people trying to figure out how to leverage technology. And last year, we were able to put a team together to leverage artificial general intelligence, so it's a little bit more advanced than a Siri or Alexa. And this late December, we got some refinement, and actually, like literally this week, we finally refined the engine well enough that it has the ability to talk to you in a casual way, the way I'm talking to you, ask it a question, you tell it something, and it responds with some level of compassion, and it creates a space for you to share. And this we hope will go a very long way in helping people build a sense of self, not to replace all the humans, but actually to complement and augment the humans. We know there's a long line of for mentors, so this is a holdover until somebody is able to get a mentor, or even if somebody has a mentor, it's how do you leverage your relationship with your mentor in a way that really maximizes it? And then for the adults, how do you feel good enough about yourself that when you're asked if you want to take on more responsibility or you want to raise a promotion, that you say yes, you don't go to the first default of, I can't possibly do this, or I'm very scared. Or even if you're very scared, you walk through it. So Valerie is one of the people that have been supportive. Gus, I don't see him anymore, but Gus has also been very helpful. he provided the mindfulness content that is helping this engine. We also have leadership development content, and it's really around helping. The way the AI responds is from a position of compassion. And so, Valerie, thank you for this opportunity to share. I appreciate it, and thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you.
So I would like to say thank you to you and to so many of us that I've had the pleasure of talking with, people that are in the community doing such a wide spectrum of things, and how we can look at this perhaps with new eyes. I wanted to just talk a little bit about education because unfortunately Pamela was not able to be here this evening, and education is such an important topic. So I'd like to tell you a story about one of a great teacher actually that I had the great fortune to spend time with and learn from. Her name is Linda Lantieri, and she was an educator and a principal in New York City public schools for years. She was a leader in this area. In 1994, she got together with Daniel Goleman, who some of you may recognize. He's the author of Emotional Intelligence and Social Intelligence, and Tim Shriver, who is the chairman of the Special Olympics, but he was an educator, and he's the son of Eunice Shriver and the nephew of President John F. Kennedy. They and other leaders in education got together in Chicago in 1994 and created what's called Social Emotional Learning, or SEL. This has been, I think, a very important wave in education. And then something happened, and I'm picking this story because I think it's apropos again of what's going on in Ukraine and in the world. Linda told us her experience with 11 schools which were in the neighborhood of the Twin Towers on September 11th. And what happened was, when the first tower was hit by the plane and fell, the schools called the administration to find out what they should do, and the administrator said, well, just stay there, we'll get back to you. Well, unfortunately, the second tower fell before anyone got back to them. And it knocked out all communication. And so the teachers decided to try to tie the children together and make a run for it, away from the Twin Towers, which is what they did. Fortunately, nobody was injured, but everybody was traumatized. And so after that happened, concerned educators and mental health workers got together and decided they needed to do something. And so they put together a group to help with these 11 schools, and this effort was pretty much led by Linda Lantieri. She went in to first talk to the students, and she heard from the younger ones, for instance, things like, well, we saw birds and butterflies falling from the buildings. Well, of course they didn't see birds and butterflies, they were seeing people jumping. But in their young minds, that's how they saw it. So they were traumatized, and I think this issue of resilience, we never know when we're going to need to be resilient. So wouldn't it perhaps be a good idea to do what we can so that when these things happen, we may fare better and be able to help more? Anyway, in this process of working with these kids and with the teachers, Linda realized that even before 9/11, they were already hanging on for dear life. And as they began this process of working, they realized that what they had put together was really necessary for not only the Department of Education in New York City, but for education nationally. And so they created what was called the Inner Resilience Program. This word is so important because I think this issue of resilience is very important. And so this has now become a very big program and a very big focus in education. Linda has now 40 years of experience. She really knows her subject, and her entire focus in the last several years has been to do her best to incorporate social emotional learning together with mindfulness in all of the schools, both elementary and high schools. And so this building resilience, what I had planned to talk about this evening was more of the interface between mindfulness and resilience. But I wanted to tell this story because it's become so clear, I think, to all of us in this area, and certainly many people in education, that it's important. And social emotional learning, for those of you who don't know, is a way of learning that we're most accustomed to, where it's coming from the outside in. With mindfulness, the learning is coming from the inside, educare, which means to draw forth. It's drawing forth from the inside and really enabling us to have a different kind of dimension in terms of deep listening, in terms of being able to have loving kindness and compassion and better relationships, which in turn, of course, fosters an environment in which children can really learn and develop. So all these things that we're talking about and what we saw in the film really are important. And so in terms of, what I'd like to say is, critically, mindfulness is one of the main things or best things that builds and fosters resilience. So it's important in that reason. It's not something that we're born with. So the good news is that everybody can learn resilience. Every community can learn to become more resilient. There has been some effort going on here in Miami-Dade County that I'm aware of, where some community leaders are coming together to focus on this building resilience in the community. If any of you in the audience tonight are interested in this, certainly Aaron and the church have made such a wonderful offer. But there will be activity happening, and there's opportunities in so many areas. So perhaps this is a time we can begin a conversation to actually do something, not just talk about, but actually begin in small ways maybe to implement these changes. So we can do it. It takes time, and importantly, as I heard John Kabat-Zinn say today, actually, he was talking about intentionality. We can become a community of intention, of intentionality, and perhaps all work together in our own ways to do what is needed. So, thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. Well, Valerie, what you just said was a perfect segue to a question that I'd love to throw out to all of you to respond to if you feel called. We've been talking about the ways in which our community can respond to ACEs and these effects. I'm interested, after listening to each of your co-panelists' responses, do you see any ways that you all think you all could collaborate, or we all could collaborate? What are some potential places of working together from your field of expertise with some of your co-panelists, or maybe another place in the community? Please, anyone who feels called, just go ahead and talk. Sure.
Absolutely. And, it's not like one person, one institution, one party created these issues, and it really requires this amazing collaboration. And I think it's about educating disciplines throughout the system. I was getting ready, I was on the bench one morning, and we had this young woman in court. I was doing her mental health docket. She was very sick. And she was very oppositional to getting treatment and very resistant to wanting treatment. and we were trying everything to try to get her help. And we've been taught now that, when we're talking to people with illnesses in our court, you don't just ask people, we're in a public setting, we wouldn't say, how's your breast cancer, so we don't like, how's your mental illness today? So first thing we do is we ask, do you mind if I ask you a personal question? And if people hesitate, I then ask them if they're more comfortable coming up to the bench and speaking more privately. And so I asked her, and she clearly hesitated, and I got her to come up to the bench with her lawyers, and we started to talk. And one thing we don't do anymore, at least try not to, is what's wrong with you? Now it's what can I do to help you? And it is amazing to watch an individual respond so differently when we respond appropriately. So I said to her, I don't know anything about your background, but what I do know is that over 90% of the women who are in jail with mental health issues have had these horrible histories of trauma. And all of a sudden she started to cry and just really broke down weeping. And she went on to tell me that when she was, I think she said 5 or 6, her father had taken her to a bar and she was sexually assaulted at this bar. And what was so horrifying to hear, because she continued to talk to us about it, I was the first person she ever told this to. I mean, think about it. A stranger, a judge, in court, she's telling me one of the most private, personal, horrific things that have happened to her. And so my answer to you through that story is that we should be doing ACEs across the board, probably starting in middle school for every child. And if we could identify these issues earlier and work with therapists, mindfulness, and helping people get access to the type of treatment that could actually help them, we would save generations from ever ending up in the criminal justice system. If you have a score of 4 or above, you have pretty much a 100% chance of having a substance use disorder. 100%. And so knowing that and not doing what we need to do is criminal in itself. And so I think one of the keys for us is to make sure that we are offering these issues, these assessment tools early, and then helping people get access. And one last thing, it's not just the defendants in our courtroom. We run a program for law enforcement here in Miami called Crisis Intervention Team Policing. It's a 40-hour training program that we teach law enforcement officers how to identify people who are in crisis, how to de-escalate the situation, and where to take them as opposed to arresting them. And we have the largest program in the country. We have well over 7,600 officers trained in every single department in Miami. But the woman that teaches my class gets 150 calls a month from police officers for their own personal mental health issues. They have severe PTSD. Last year, more officers died from suicide than in the line of duty. And not only do they have high suicide rates, they have high substance use disorder, they have high divorce rates and high domestic violence rates. And so we need to make sure that we are assessing people all across the board, making sure that they are getting access to treatment. Because as a result, what we did is we ended up setting up a treatment program for our law enforcement in Miami outside of the department, because they wouldn't go, obviously, for treatment at their own departments. And as a result, what happened? Our police shootings have almost stopped here. And violence against individuals has almost stopped here by law enforcement. And so there are a lot of things that this cuts across that we don't think about, that we really could be doing so much more if we collaborated more, we got people access to treatment, and we made it a healthier and happier community.
Thank you, Trish. Yes. Anyone else from the panel want to respond to that question?
I would say that grief, in the realm of grief is a social justice issue that needs to be talked about. There are, if you look at data research, there are early mortality disparities for racial and ethnic minorities COVID certainly brought that to the forefront. That, in the legal realm, in the event of homicides, or to just have a resource for the family, for the survivors, that they have a place that they can go to, that they don't have to be alone with their grief. They have a place where they can make sense of everything that's going on and to think about it together as a family. Integrative medicine to really help the person know what they feel, to take care of themselves, to learn healthy coping strategies. What can prolong grief, what can complicate grief and turn it into a mental health, more severe mental health pathology, is when we're not using healthy coping strategies, when we're numbing what we're feeling, when we're engaging in unhealthy behaviors. So to learn how to take care of our bodies and to center ourselves, to become aware of what we're feeling, aware of what we're thinking. It can be disorienting to feel these strong emotions. There are swings of good days, bad days. So to be able to center ourselves and make that a daily practice can become a really useful tool in the grieving experience, regardless of your age. So I think we can all come together and help each other out.
I think my co-panelists gave very excellent responses on what we can all do, and we're doing it tonight. I think the answer is just don't let children go unrecognized and untreated and unseen and unheard. If you're a pediatrician, you want to include those ACEs screenings in your practice. If you're a judge, you've already got that going on. If you're in the police department, training them on child development and signs and symptoms of trauma, or even if there is an event that there's a child not connected to it, there might be a child who's, it's someone's grandmother or something, so checking up on them. If you're a teacher, there's curriculums, ICL curriculums mentioned. So because if we leave it untreated, and then the long-term developmental trajectories we see is in mass incarceration, addiction, suicidal behavior, crisis responses, school shootings, and things like that. So, educating as many people, getting this into the hands of as many people as possible, making it universal. This is a public health crisis. We need to do something about it now. We're doing something about it tonight, and hopefully after tonight, we can continue to collaborate on more ways together.
So I think one important step we can all take as a community is, if you know a doctor or nurse, give them a big hug. And the reason for that, thank you, the reason for that is because, we could all use more hugs, number one. Number two is because, just over the last 2 years with this pandemic, the emotional, psychological stress that medical professionals have been facing has been just really overwhelming for so many. And it's given rise to things that were already endemic in our population, which include substance abuse, divorce, suicide, and so many other adverse outcomes that we've heard today. Those really have been magnified over the past 2 years. And at Memorial, we really sought out to try and do something about it. And so we kind of organized a coalition of the willing. And these were well-intentioned individuals from our integrative medicine program, psychologists and nutritionists and exercise physiologists and mindfulness experts. And we all kind of got together and started creating all this content and making it available to our frontline healthcare professionals in hopes that they would take advantage of these resources and really start to feel better. And what we realized is we got a lot of feedback, and one of the major areas of feedback that we received was, all of this content that you have developed is wonderful, and I really wish I had the time and bandwidth to actually access some of these wonderful resources that you've put together. And so we kind of changed our thinking into really kind of weaving the practices of well-being and weaving the resilience-building exercises and efforts into our daily routines. That looks like starting a meeting with a moment of mindfulness, some breathing exercises, some guided imagery, some creative visualizations, beginning rounds with your team with some gentle yoga stretches and deep breathing. So really weave these exercises, these practices that are so now evidence-based, weave these into our daily routines and make them sort of embedded within our workplace, within our homes, within our schools. When this becomes part of our culture, when this becomes second nature to us, I think that we will be all healthier and happier community. Thank you.
I'd like to add something about the teachers who also, I think, have had a very difficult time the last couple of years. And mindfulness has gone into our Miami-Dade County Public School system. We brought that into the schools in, I think, it began in 2015. And I know there are several teachers here, I think from Mindful Kids Miami, I think you're still here, I saw you earlier. There are many wonderful people that are really working to try to implement this mindfulness within the school system. But there are other schools and other areas where it isn't being done. And so my recommendation would be to see if we can't broaden this incorporation of mindfulness in the schools. People in different organizations tend to do things differently. And so in some of the schools, the emphasis is more on training teachers to teach the children. So they're taught techniques, strategies, things that they can bring into the classroom. That's called the direct training approach. Most experts find that the indirect training approach is more effective. Not only is it more effective for the students and the teachers, but it's more effective for the entire school system. And so that indirect approach is training the teachers themselves first. I'm telling the story about Linda Lantieri, and she got a lot of money from the 9/11 fund to work in these schools, and they wanted her to go in there and train the kids right away. And she said, no. We have to start with the teachers. We have to start with the adults. And my experience, I could not agree with that more. It is a very important lesson because it's the teachers who are on the front lines. And many of the teachers are suffering from, well, certainly in their case, either trauma or vicarious trauma. They really need the benefit and the healing that can come from mindfulness and SEL. But the mindfulness is what makes the SEL, I think, more effective. And so healing our teachers is critically important. And so I think that we need to take the time and perhaps sometimes have a difficult conversation and try to help people understand why it's so important to start with the adults. Because when they are trained and they go into the classroom, they can literally embody mindfulness. They can, there is a presence, there is an attention, there is a kindness, there is a total environmental change. There's a felt change in the classroom. And so that is more effective, and certainly it improves the lives of the teachers and the students and the entire system. So that would be something that I would strongly recommend. We try to do more of. Lots of people are working on it, and blessings to all of you who are, but we need more of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. Well, I think we have time for maybe a question or two from the audience. If any of you have a burning question for our panel, please step up to the microphone, introduce yourself, and ask the question.
Good evening, thank you everybody. My name is Javier Luque. We can talk about Ukraine and everything, but I'm going to bring it very close to home right now. With what is happening in our state and laws, and I don't want to make this a political conversation, it has brought up to me a little bit of the trauma of my experience as a second grader in the school, and my classmates calling me the names of the gay actor in the soap opera that was popular in my country of Honduras, where I was born. And the teacher addressing my complaint that my bullies were were making fun of me because I was different. Give it years in reparative therapy and trying to define myself until 7 years ago where I finally accepted myself. I can tell you I turned out very well, and I give it the credit to great therapy. It is very important. Invest in it. But with what's happening on the loss that we are bringing forward that are present kids, how do we relate the ACE and the impact of what we're doing to kids today, or minorities that have been oppressed? If that's the platform that we're giving them earlier on, how do you see that impacting them on this conversation of the ACE? Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful question.
I can jump in. That's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. What the documentary mentioned that I think was such an important point that extends very nicely to your question is the concept of repression. This idea that we're not going to talk about this and how damaging, how absolutely damaging that idea is to just sweep it under the rug. And you didn't say it, but I'm sure you're referring to the Don't Say Gay bill. To not talk about sexual identity, gender identity is so damaging because we are humans. We have an identity, sexual identity and gender identity that starts and forms at a very young age and expresses itself throughout the lifespan. So to say we are not going to talk about this, you are robbing children the opportunity to find out who they are. And that needs to start at a very young age. And when we don't find out who we are, when we don't know who we are, and we hide who we are, that is when mental illness starts. That's when problems start to arise. And we need to talk about this. We need to have conversations. So thank you for bringing that up.
Hello, my name is Susan Stanbrook. I'm a curriculum specialist, an English teacher, storyteller, and yoga and mindfulness instructor. And so I want to thank you all so much for this wonderful information and your dedication to helping one life at a time. My question is, the ancient practices, as Dr. Greta pointed out, focus on connecting body, mind, and spirit or soul. And it has been my experience that those who have experienced trauma, it has chipped away at essence, at soul, at real self. In Sanskrit, it's called Purusha. Disney actually has a movie that personifies soul so beautifully and shows how those who have the negative hardwiring actually disassociate, and we see lots of negative behaviors. And so my question is, are there any practices or any cognitive therapies, curriculums available that rebuild essence, rebuild soul, using some of the practices that have worked for 5,000 years in terms of self-remembering, with self-compassion, self-observation, and so forth? I wonder if anyone could address that.
Thank you. Thank you for your question and for all the great work that you do. Historically, yoga and mindfulness practices, particularly the physical form of yoga, was taught to children in schools. And you can even, those of us who are familiar with some of these poses, they even conjure up a childlike imagination, right? There's the frog pose and the elephant pose and the lion pose. And so, so much of what we see in terms of how trauma impacts individuals, it impacts us all, but some more than others, is this sort of lack of control. What the moment in the documentary that really was moving to me was when the teacher said, "Show me what control looks like," and the children really responded. And so ultimately, when we talk about toxic stress and how trauma can manifest in toxic stress, it's when that needle gets stuck on that fight and flight, the stress response end of the spectrum. When we practice yoga, for example, we become we befriend our limitations. We begin to increase our self-awareness by getting comfortable with how we are limited. And when we engage in any practice that starts to push those limitations further back, those children are empowered by thinking, gosh, if just by engaging in these simple stretches and poses that I find kind of fun, that I can actually gain, I can balance better, and I feel stronger, and I feel more in control of my physical self. So it doesn't take too much of a stretch of the imagination to think that if the physical practice of yoga or Tai Chi or so many other wonderful healing traditions can actually empower children to gain that self-efficacy, to feel like we are actually in control of things which we ought to be in control of in terms of our understanding, then it doesn't take too much of a stretch of the imagination to think that mindfulness can actually help us regulate our emotions and control our auto-regulate, through increased self-awareness and greater emotional intelligence. So all of these healing practices are really pivotal to your question.
First, I want to thank all the panelists for such wonderful conversation we had tonight. So a couple of weeks ago, I attended a convention and listened to various panels similar to this one by psychiatrists, medical doctors, lawyers, and experts about neuroplasticity, mindfulness meditation, and the role of ketamine and psychedelics in mitigating the detrimental effects of trauma and ACEs in adulthood. And for the sake of discussion with any of our panelists today, I'd like to comment on the implications of using these substances as a modality toward healing, and also how do we address the stigma around the matter.
It's a great question, if I may. So, a lot of these psychedelic substances have been used in many healing traditions, the world over, as a rite of passage. And if you study anthropology and history, you will know how a lot of this plant medicine actually stems from these coming of age rituals that were practiced in many different cultures. And what we're beginning to learn through science is that these psychoactive substances, these psychedelics, hallucinogenics, they impact an area of the brain which actually is the same area of the brain that lights up with loving detachment. And the reason that it's so important when it comes to stressors and healing from trauma is to understand that there is an innate part of our brain that helps us distance ourselves from our trauma so that we can more objectively handle our toxic stress. And so that's where psychedelics and hallucinogenics are being studied and will inevitably play a role. I mean, I'm not saying that these are things that should be done in terms of a regular practice. What I'm saying is that the wisdom of these ancient healing traditions, the power of observation, showed them and show us that these psychedelics can actually impact a part of the brain which is responsible for that compassionate detachment, that loving detachment that helps us distance ourselves from our traumas and our stressors in order to rise beyond them, in order to transcend them. And so I think that the area of research in psychedelics and how they are going to be used in future. There was a recent interview on NPR about a veteran with very severe post-traumatic stress disorder, and there was this experimental protocol where this therapist, this psychotherapist, was actually providing a dose of a psychedelic to the veteran prior to the therapy session. And when the NPR interviewer asked what it felt like, to undergo that session, he said, it felt like everybody in the world who loves me was hugging me at the same time. And so it's very powerful that way. So I think that the research is in its infancy, but I think that we can certainly draw upon the wisdom of ancient healing traditions to to guide our questions and in our research in this area. Thank you.
Any more questions? Well, friends, first of all, let's give a round of applause for our winners. And thank you to all of you for joining us this evening.